Magnus the Red was the most powerful psyker the Emperor ever sired. A Primarch who could walk the warp like a second home, who saw futures other men could not imagine, who believed, right up until it destroyed him, that there was no knowledge he could not safely touch. And the Emperor knew exactly how dangerous that made him. So ask the obvious question. If you are building 20 sons, and one of them is a sorcerer powerful enough to one day crack your Imperium open, what do you build to stop him? You do not build a stronger sorcerer. There isn't one. You build the opposite. You build a void. A Primarch who is a hole in the warp. A null so absolute that he could stand in front of Magnus the Red and simply switch him off. The Emperor built that brother. His name is one of the two the Imperium erased.
And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The weapon built to stop Magnus is gone. Magnus is still here. And somewhere in that red giant's ruined memory, there is a scar shaped exactly like the brother he was never supposed to be able to beat. That is the thesis. And I am going to be honest with you about what it is before I spend the next half hour building it. This is the most provocative reading of a gap the Imperium left on purpose. Games Workshop has never shown you a fight between Magnus and the 11th. They have never said the Emperor designed a son to be his antithesis. Aaron Dembski Bowden, the author who wrote more of the Lost Primarch Silence than anyone, said it plainly in 2018. There is not allowed to be an answer. So we are not here to claim canon. We are here to take three things the canon does confirm, set them next to each other, and ask what shape the silence between them makes. The audience already asked it for us.
Under the channel's Pariah gene work, a viewer named Ginger Anagram left a comment with 234 likes and 27 replies that said the 11th was the counter to Magnus, the source of the Pariah gene. 234 people looked at the same gap and saw the same answer. We are going to find out why. Start with the sorcerer, because everything begins with how dangerous he was. In 1,000 Suns, Graham McNeil's 2010 novel, Magnus is not written as a villain. He is written as the brightest mind the Emperor ever made, and the tragedy is that brightness was the flaw. Magnus believed he could use the warp without the warp using him. He treated the great ocean of the immaterium the way a scholar treats a library. Somewhere to go, take what you need, come home unchanged. The canon is brutally clear on what that confidence cost. His careless application of his own gifts is what undid him. Not weakness, not cowardice, confidence.
The conviction that there was no door in the universe he was not clever enough to open and walk back out of. And the Emperor saw it. This is the detail people skip past. The Emperor did not fear Magnus the way you fear an enemy. He feared him the way an engineer fears the one component in a machine that is rated beyond every safety margin around it. Magnus could do things no other son could do, which meant Magnus could break things no other son could break. You do not build a safeguard for the weak link. You build a safeguard for the strong one, the part that, if it fails, takes the whole structure with it. So here is the question the Emperor would have had to answer at the moment he understood what Magnus was. What do you put in the room with a god of sorcery to make sure that, on the day he goes too far, somebody can close the door he opened? You cannot answer that with more power. That is the trap people fall into. They imagine the counter to the strongest psyker is a stronger psyker. And there is no stronger psyker. That is what strongest means. A more powerful sorcerer is not a break on Magnus. He is a second Magnus, a second catastrophe. Twice the risk and none of the safety. The only thing that stops a sorcerer is not more of what a sorcerer is. It is the absence of it entirely.
It is the one phenomenon in this whole grim universe that psychic power cannot touch, cannot read, cannot reach, and cannot bend. The Imperium has a name for that phenomenon. It calls it a null. And this is where the canon stops being theory and starts being mechanics. Because the off switch the Emperor would have needed is not invented. It already exists, and the records are precise about exactly what it does. Let me give you the second source and a second voice in this story, because the intro is closing and you need to see the weapon clearly.
The Codex of the Officio Assassinorum, specifically the Culexis Temple, is the canonical record of the null phenomenon. Blanks, pariahs, untouchables, nulls. 4 names for the same impossible thing, a human being born with a negative presence in the warp. Where you and I and every psyker leaves a ripple in the immaterium, a null leaves a hole. The warp does not see them. It cannot. And the lore is exact about what that does to a psyker who stands too close. Being near a null, the sources say, is for a psyker physically painful, like having a sense amputated. Not frightened, not unsettled, amputated. A part of him that has worked his entire life simply stops, and the silence where it was is agony. Now scale that up. A weak null makes a sorcerer uncomfortable. A powerful null does something else entirely. The records on the Culexis are clear. A sufficiently strong blank can generate a null zone large enough to shut down all psychic activity across a room, across a battlefield. Inside that zone, the connection to the warp is not weakened, it is severed. The powers do not work. The wards do not hold. The warp spawn protections a sorcerer wraps around himself fall away like a coat in a fire. And the Imperium weaponizes exactly this. The Culexis assassin wears a device called the Animus Speculum. And here is the detail that should make your skin crawl when you think about Magnus. The speculum gets stronger the closer it is to a psyker. It feeds on the thing it is built to destroy. The more powerful the sorcerer in front of it, the more lethal the void becomes. There is no psyker in the galaxy that device was built to want more than the most powerful psyker in the galaxy. And it is not only psykers the void unmakes. The same records are clear about what a null does to a demon, and this matters more for Magnus than it first appears, because of where Magnus ended up. A demon in the presence of a blank finds its tether to the warp weakened, its power draining, its very existence threatened. A strong enough null does not merely repel the warp's children, it banishes lesser ones simply by being near them, and it can stagger the greater ones. Hold that thought. The being the 11th was built to stop became, in the end, a demon prince. So the off switch was not only an answer to Magnus the sorcerer, it was an answer to everything Magnus was always going to become. The Culexis carries one more device worth naming, the Ethereum, which floods the space around the assassin with confusion so total that nothing, psyker or not, can fix him in its sight. The whole design of the null weapon is disappearance, a thing the warp cannot see, a thing the eye cannot hold, a thing whose entire combat doctrine is to be the one presence on the field that simply will not register. Now imagine that doctrine grown to the scale of a Primarch and pointed at the one sun who lived inside the very sense it erases. So picture the Emperor's problem and the Emperor's answer in the same frame. The problem is a sorcerer's son so strong that conventional power cannot check him. The answer is a phenomenon, already real in this universe, that becomes most dangerous precisely against the strongest psyker alive. You do not need to invent anything to see where this goes. You only need to ask one question. If the Imperium will build a single mortal assassin around the null phenomenon and point it at psykers, what would the Emperor, who built gods,
build around the same phenomenon if the psyker he needed to be able to stop was his own son. Not a man with a helmet, a brother. A Primarch made of the same silence the Colexis only borrows. A null at the scale of a demigod. An off-switch the size of Magnus himself. That is the reading.
The 11th was not a stronger version of his brothers.
He was the negative of one of them. And against Magnus specifically, he was not a soldier sent to fight. He was a switch built to be thrown. You keep a weapon like that in reserve. You do not spend it in border skirmishes. You hold it, quietly, for the one day you have been dreading since you first understood what your brightest son might become. The day the sorcerer reaches for a door he should not open, and someone has to be able to walk into the room and turn the warp off. And here is why this is not as wild a thing to attribute to the Emperor as it might sound. We know, from Chris Wright's Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, what kind of designer the Emperor actually was.
This is the man who raised the Thunder Warriors, the flawed proto-Astartes who won him unity, and then, the moment they had served their purpose, had them culled by the Custodes under Constantine Valdor, so that the Empire would never have to remember being built by them. This is the man who ran the Primarch project with the geneticist Amar Astarte, treating his own sons as a problem in applied genetics before they were ever children. The Emperor did not build out of love. He built out of necessity, and he discarded out of necessity, and he erased out of necessity. A father who has his first army quietly removed because they had become inconvenient is exactly the kind of mind that builds one son specifically to be able to end another, and then removes the record when the contingency has served its terrible purpose. The anti-Magnus design intent is a fan synthesis. I will say that as many times as it takes. But it is a synthesis laid on top of a documented pattern.
The Emperor has done this before. He built a weapon for a job, used it, and unmade the memory. We are only asking whether he did it one more time, with one more son, for the most dangerous job of all. Here is where the canon goes quiet, and where I have to keep my promise to you. We are now past anything Games Workshop has printed. There is no novel where this happens. There is no codex entry. What there is a shape. And the shape is suggestive enough that 234 people filled it in the same way. So let me build the collision carefully and flag every place where I am reading rather than reporting. If the off switch existed, then at some point the Emperor's hand would have hovered over it, and the moment is almost too obvious. Magnus is the son defined by going too far. By reaching for power he was warned away from, by trusting himself to handle forces that handle everyone else.
A counter built for that exact failure would be drawn out of reserve at the exact moment the failure began. Early enough that the wider galaxy never logged it. Early enough to be folded into the general chaos of an age when legions were still being raised and lost. Two Primarchs vanish from the records roughly 43 years before the drop site disaster at Istvan V. We know that from the first heretic, because at Monarchia only 18 legions are ever counted. The erasure is already complete before the heresy proper begins. Whatever happened to the 11th happened in the dark, decades before the galaxy was watching the brothers turn on each other. And here is the cruel symmetry that makes the collision a real story rather than a foregone one. A null, powerful enough to threaten Magnus, is not invulnerable. He is vulnerable in the exact ways a psyker is not. The Void's whole strength is the absence of warp presence,
which means in the material, in the physical, in the brute arithmetic of two demigods in a room, he has no sorcery to fall back on, no future sight, no shield woven from the immaterium. The thing that makes him lethal to Magnus is the same thing that strips him of everything else. So, the encounter is not a foregone conclusion. It is a genuine knife edge. Inside the null zone, Magnus is immortal, his powers gone, his sight blind. The warp he treats as a second home suddenly a closed and silent place. But outside it, in the seconds before the void closes the distance, Magnus is still the most powerful being the Emperor ever made, and he knows it, and he has never once in his life believed he could lose. The fight could have ended with either of them gone. The reading is that it ended with the void gone and Magnus still standing, scarred but standing. I want to be exact. The canon does not say this happened.
The canon does not say it did not. This is the most provocative way to fill a silence the author told us was built to stay silent. Think about what that confrontation would actually have felt like from inside Magnus's mind, because it is the strangest fight in the whole imagined history of the legions. Magnus has never, in his entire existence, met something his sight could not see. He looks at the universe and reads it, the futures, the warp currents, the soul of every being in the room. It is the sense he trusts above all others, the one that has never once failed him. And then a brother walks in, and that sense goes dark. Not dim, dark. For the first time in his life, the most perceptive being the Emperor ever made is blind, standing in a silence so total that the warp itself has been switched off around him, facing a brother he cannot read, cannot predict, cannot touch with a single one of the powers that define him. A normal Primarch would feel fear. Magnus would feel something worse. The absolute novelty of helplessness, in a mind that had organized its entire identity around never being helpless. That is the moment the off switch was built for, and a being that arrogant, faced for the first time with the one thing that makes him ordinary, would do exactly what arrogance always does. He would refuse to accept it. He would reach for power that was no longer there, and reach, in the dead air where his God self used to be. And that reaching, in the presence of the thing that turns reaching into agony, is the wound that never closes. But suppose it did end that way. Suppose the off switch was thrown, and the sorcerer found the strength, or the luck, or the desperation, to break the void before the void closed the door on him forever. Now you have a much harder question than how the fight ended. You have the question of why nobody ever told you it happened. Because if a loyal Primarch had fallen stopping a traitor, the Imperium would have built a cathedral around it. That is what the Imperium does with martyrs. It carves them into the walls. So why this one wound, of all the wounds in that bloody age, sealed so completely that 10,000 years later the most powerful intelligences in the galaxy cannot agree the man ever existed? The answer is in the nature of the erasure itself, and this part is canon. The removal of the second and the 11th was not a footnote going missing. It was an edict of obliteration, a damnatio memoriae, High Gothic for the condemnation of memory. Imperial historians regard it as the single most successful act of erasure ever carried out in the Imperium's history. And it did not stop at the archives. There is a story called The Chamber at the End of Memory, and what it reveals is the part that should frighten you. Every ordinary servant of the Imperium had their minds wiped of the lost legions, and the Primarchs themselves had their own memories altered, until they could recall almost nothing beyond the bare fact that two brothers had once existed. They did not just strike the records. They went into the heads of gods and cut the memory out. You do not do that to hide an accident. You do that to hide a truth that would unmake you if it were known. And look at what survived the purge, because the survivors tell you what the censors were willing to leave behind and what they were not. They did not leave the names. They did not leave the deeds. What they left were 2 empty plinths beneath the roof of the hegemon on Terra, and 2 bare skulls, marked only with the numerals 2
and 11, set into the throne of Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted regent and the keeper of every secret on Terra. That is a very particular kind of erasure. They did not pretend the brothers never existed. They left a deliberate, permanent, 10,000-year-old monument to the fact that two sons had been removed and would not be discussed. A blank space, carefully maintained. You do not build a monument to forgetting unless the thing forgotten was important enough that its absence had to be marked, so no one would wander in and ask what belonged there. The empty plinth is not the absence of a memorial. It is the memorial, a memorial to the act of erasure itself. And the other brothers were made to keep its silence.
Apart from a few snatched, suggestive fragments, not one of the 18 surviving Primarchs ever speaks of the lost two, across the whole span of the heresy. Gods who would not flinch from the carnage at Istvan, who would not look away from the ruin of Terra, will not say two names. That is not grief. Grief talks. That is something closer to a wound everyone agreed never to touch. And consider what this particular truth would unmake. The entire myth of the Emperor's sons rests on a single idea, that they were brothers, raised to stand together, a unified brotherhood broken only when Horus chose betrayal. That is the story the Imperium tells to hold itself together. Now imagine the document that says otherwise. Imagine the record that admits the Emperor did not build 20 brothers.
He built 19 brothers and 1 executioner. A son designed from conception to be able to end another son, held in reserve against the day his own family produced the catastrophe he was secretly certain it would. That is not a family. That is a contingency plan with a pulse. And the moment that record exists, the founding lie of the Imperium, that these were sons and not weapons pointed at each other, does not survive contact with it. You would erase that. You would erase it from the books, and from the minds, and from the memory of the gods who lived it. You would build the most successful act of forgetting in your history around exactly this. Which brings us to the strongest piece of confirmation the canon will give us. Not proof of the fight, but proof of the stakes. There is a moment where Sanguinius, the most beloved of all the sons, is so afraid of his own legion's hidden genetic flaw that he refuses to tell his father about it.
And the reason he gives is the reason that should stop you cold. He will not risk a third empty plinth being raised beneath the roof of the hegemon as his legion's only memorial. He knows about the 2 empty plinths. He knows what they mean. And he is so terrified of becoming the third that he will carry a lethal secret to the grave rather than be erased the way the 2nd and the 11th were erased. The empty plinth is the most feared punishment in the Imperium. Worse than death. Worse than damnation. A traitor at least gets remembered. The plinth means you were so dangerous that the universe was made to forget you ever drew breath. That is the punishment the 11th received. Ask yourself what a loyal son has to do to earn the worst sentence the Imperium can impose. Now, I owe you the objection because the audience for this channel raises it every time, and it is a good one. If the 11th were a null, if he were genuinely something unprecedented at the genetic level, surely the gene tithe, the testing, the endless imperial obsession with corruption in the blood would have caught it. Surely someone would have looked at his gene seed and seen the anomaly. And here is why that objection does not land the way people think it does. A null does not read as corruption. A null reads as absence. The lore is exact. Where every other living thing makes a presence in the warp, a blank makes a void, a hole where a soul should be. Corruption is something added, a taint, a mark, a stain in the blood that testing is built to find. But a null is something subtracted. There is nothing there to find. So when the records say nothing unusual was discovered,
When the gene seed came back clean, that is not the theory failing. That is exactly what a blank would produce. The absence is the signature. You cannot detect a hole by looking for a stain.
The clean reading is not the refutation. It might be the fingerprint. I told you there would be a second voice in this story, and now the intro's promise comes back around. Because the wound does not stay in the 11th, it crosses over into Magnus. If the off switch was thrown and the sorcerer broke it, then think about what that act would do to a psyker specifically. Every other Primarch who lost a brother carried the grief in their heart, in their memory, in the ordinary human places grief lives. But Magnus does not only live in those places. Magnus lives in the warp. His mind extends into the Imperium the way a tree's roots extend into soil. And to end a null, to be inside that void in the moment it dies, is to take the wound in the one place a sorcerer can never heal. Not a scar in the flesh, a scar in the warp, a dead patch in the Imperium where a piece of the galaxy's greatest psyker used to connect, and now does not. And this reframes everything that comes after. We are used to thinking of Magnus's downfall as a single decision. The moment he broke the wards. The moment he reached for forbidden sorcery. The moment he made his deal. But a wound like this would mean the downfall started decades earlier. In a room nobody remembers. With a brother nobody is allowed to name. It would mean that by the time Tzeentch came whispering, Magnus was not a whole and confident sorcerer being tempted. He was a damaged one. A man with a blind patch in his soul, already carrying a silence he could not explain, already missing a piece of himself in the exact place a chaos god would later climb in. We are told Magnus was undone by arrogance. What if he was undone by an injury that arrogance would not let him admit he had? Those are not the same story. One is a morality tale about pride. The other is the slow consequence of an act so terrible the universe was rearranged so he would not have to remember committing it. The canon will not confirm that this is the source.
The canon gives Magnus a different documented cause for his fragmentation. The splintering of his soul after Prospero, the shards gathered up by his own son Ahriman and reforged into the thing called the Crimson King. I am not overwriting that. I am asking you to sit with the reading laid over it. That a man who already had a wound in his warp self, a blind patch in the one sense he trusted above all others, would be the easiest prey in the galaxy for a power that whispers through exactly that sense. Because that is what happened next, and that part is canon. Magnus found a corridor in the warp leading to Terra, and a voice offered him the power to break through. He took it. He shattered the Emperor's wards, let the warp pour into the great work, and the voice that helped him was Tzeentch. The most arrogant son, certain he could touch any knowledge safely, walked straight into the trap the Chaos God had been laying his whole life.
A psyker with a blind spot is a psyker who cannot see the predator coming through the blind spot.
If you wanted to write the origin of how the brightest of the suns became the most thoroughly deceived, you could hardly do better than to put a hole in his warp sight first, and stand back. There is a parallel theory I want to bring in for 60 seconds, and only 60, because it tells you something about why this gap behaves the way it does. Another channel, Ordo Illuminati, ran a video with 36,000 views, arguing that a lost Primarch became the tyrannid hive mind, the gestalt psychic intelligence that drifts in from outside the galaxy to consume it. It is a completely different answer to our question, but notice what it shares with ours. Both theories take an erased Primarch and ask the same thing: where did the power go? When you delete a being that powerful from history, you do not delete the hole he leaves.
The galaxy abhors that vacuum,
and every theorist rushes to fill it. With a hive mind, with a pariah gene, with an answer. The hive mind reading and the anti-Magnus reading cannot both be true, but they are both reaching for the same missing piece. That is what an erased Primarch becomes, not an answer, but a magnet for them. I am not telling you the 11th became the hive mind. I am telling you that the silence is so loud it pulls theories toward it from every direction, and ours is one of them, and honesty means saying so. So let me bring it home, because the irony at the center of this is the part that actually matters. Strip away every claim I cannot prove, and you are left with one structure that the canon does support. The Emperor built his most dangerous son knowing he was dangerous. The phenomenon that could have stopped that son is real, and it becomes most lethal against exactly the kind of psyker Magnus was.
2 sons were erased so completely that gods had the memory cut out of their heads. And the Imperium treats that erasure as a punishment worse than death. A punishment Sanguinius would rather die than receive. Set those facts side by side, and the most provocative reading writes itself. The Emperor built a perfect counter to his most dangerous son, and his most dangerous son destroyed it. He did not just end a brother. He removed the one safeguard the Emperor had built against the precise catastrophe the 11th was made to prevent, and then went on to become that catastrophe, the breaker of the warp wards, the door Tzeentch walked through, with no off switch left anywhere in the galaxy to stop him. The insurance policy against Magnus the Red was spent by Magnus the Red. That is why it had to be erased, not because the Emperor failed, because he succeeded, and his success was used against him by the very son it was built to contain. The Emperor built 20 sons, and at least one of them was an answer to a question the others couldn't survive. What stops Magnus the Red? The answer was a brother made of silence, a void that could walk up to the galaxy's greatest sorcerer and turn him off like a light. The Emperor built the perfect counter to his most dangerous son, and then his most dangerous son killed it. We will never find the 11th Primarch's body, because the Imperium erased the grave along with the name. But we can still see the wound. It's in Magnus, in the gaps, in the scar, in the trauma a psyker should not have. The opposite the Emperor built to save us is gone. The thing it was built to stop is still out there, and it remembers winning.